You know, my room is a disaster, my hair is a mess, but I feel super productive because I've gotten so much done. For years, I have had a long arm, and a lot of the time, the long arm sits turned off because I just don't have the time, the energy, or even really the desire to walk over, turn it on, and manually stitch out all of my designs. I have been waiting for the day when I can finally take the plunge into the world of automation, and that day is here. So in today's video, I've got a little bit of something different for you. We're going to have what I'm going to call a watch party. I'm going to take you through me quilting out a quilt, start to finish, and we're going to do it together. So let's get going. All right, so we're going to have a little bit of a watch party together. Throughout this 15-ish minute video, I'm going to have some notes and commentary for you, and when I have something to say or I want to talk about what I'm doing, I'll pop up on the screen, and when I don't, I'll disappear, and I'll just leave it for you to watch with a little bit of music in the background. So what am I doing right now? Well, I have taken all of this footage of me quilting a Jelly Roll Race quilt that my mom gave to me. And I'm so excited because the backing for this quilt, which you can see I'm loading right now, is actually a piece of 108 that was left over, and it wasn't wide enough for any of the other quilts that I had, but it was just barely wide enough for this quilt. So I'm really excited because now this finished quilt has a story from the front and a story from the back, and it even has a story with the stitches, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So I use I think they're called Renee's red snappers. If you look for red snappers, you're going to see the product that I use. It's basically a clamping system. You put a pole in the casing on your leaders and you use these little red clamps to hold your fabric to the leader and the pole, and it makes basting or loading quilt backing really, really, really simple. It does take a little bit of time to get the clamps so that they don't hurt your hands because they're really tough in the beginning. But I also cut mine down into manageable pieces, and I use the bar to help give me a little bit of extra push when I'm putting the clamps on. So here I'm loading my batting onto the frame, and I just want to let you know that I use Quilter's Dream Bamboo. It is my go-to batting for most any quilt that I make. I like it because it's lightweight and very breathable, but it's also plenty warm enough. I live in Northern Virginia. It doesn't get super cold here, and these quilts are great year-round with that batting. I did cut it down so that it is just as wide as my backing, and now I'm just putting my quilt top on top of here. And you may notice that some of those drawers underneath my long arm are open. Let me tell you why I do that. This is genius. So I don't have a net or another system that allows me to kind of put the quilt top and batting underneath the long arm, but I do have all of these drawers. And so I don't like to have my batting and my quilt top just hanging out on the floor when I'm loading it or when I'm working on it. I have dogs that run around my studio sometimes, and I'm walking back and forth. I don't want to be stepping on that stuff. So I'll pick it up, I'll pull out some of the drawers, and I'll put the bulk or the weight of the quilt top and stuff in those drawers. Sometimes I can set it on top of the surface above, like that flat surface that you see running underneath my long arm. Those are just IKEA shelves that I got, and I put the drawer inserts and cabinet doors on them. Once everything's loaded onto the frame, then it's time to figure out, what do I want the Prostitcher to stitch out for me? And I'm really actually kind of excited about this because I found a pantograph that I think is just perfect. It's got a combination of hearts and rainbows on it. You can see I just kind of flashed it on the screen there really quickly for you, but I'm going to put a better picture up here so you can appreciate the stuff that's stitching out. I'm really excited about this because the rainbows are a nod to the color of the fabric. I feel like there's a lot of rainbow stuff happening on the quilt top, but also the hearts that are nestled into that rainbow. My mom loves hearts, and I felt like that would be something she would definitely pick. So I was really excited to find this pantograph. Also, bonus, it's a really big pantograph, and I felt like it was going to stitch out pretty quickly, which would allow this quilt to go into the get it trimmed and bound pile pretty doggone quick. I know this video is only just a few minutes long, but I want to let you know from start to finish the time that it took to load and stitch out and then take the quilt off of the frame, it took me about an hour and a half. So yes, this footage is sped up. It didn't really take me 10 minutes to do this whole quilt. I mean, you probably figured that out by how I'm moving back and forth on the screen, right? Okay, this is where things get a little magical, because once I've put in all of the parameters for my quilt and I'm ready for things to stitch out, the machine does the work for me. You can see on the video clip here, the machine is actually moving completely independently and it's doing all of the stitching, and I love that. In fact, I feel like for the rest of this video, we just need to watch the machine stitch it out, because otherwise, if I kept you at this angle where you're on the opposite side of the room, just watching it move left to right, that's kind of boring. So let me bring you in really close so you can see some of the detail of stitching. Now, spoiler alert, I'm gonna let you know, the thread I chose kind of blends into the fabric, so you might not see the stitching pop out as much as you would if I was using a high contrast thread and fabric. I'm almost done with the first pass here, and it's time to advance the quilt. So once it finishes this first pass, I'm going to use this drag and drop feature that I learned about from Prostitcher that will allow me to advance my quilt. So I'm going to just put my machine at the lowest point of stitching from the first pass, drop my needle, and toggle the drag and drop feature on the screen for my machine. I'm going to advance the quilt, and then I'm going to pick up the needle and turn that feature off. And that keeps my panto lined up with my quilt top. And then it's time to baste down the sides, which you can see the extreme close up here of me doing. And once the sides are basted down, I can go back to that start point, hit the resume button, and the machine will take over filling in the next pass of the pantograph. This is great because I can make sure that all of my passes are lined up and snugged up together accurately by using that drag and drop feature. I always wondered how long armors did that. I don't know if you're a long armor, if that's the way that you do it, but this has been working out really well for me. So you may have noticed I've changed the camera angle a little bit for you. Instead of having you off to the side watching the machine go back and forth on the quilt, you're now right above the needle, so you can kind of see the stitching going on the quilt as the machine is moving left to right. So a little bit of a different view. It's still going to be hard for you to see the stitches though, because like I said, that thread really blends into the fabric. So it's not popping off as much as it would if it was a high contrast thread and fabric, but you can see the texture. And that's where those rainbows and hearts are kind of coming into play. All right, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier that I really struggled with this quilt is the amount of fullness that was in there. You can see when I was basting this in, and maybe you can even see it as I'm quilting, the top doesn't lay perfectly flat. Those rows are not straight where they really ought to be. And actually one side of the quilt is bigger by quite a bit than the other. So the way I dealt with that is every time I advanced the quilt, I just kind of basted a little bit more of that side of the quilt in, kind of easing it up. It did end up creating some areas in the quilt top where there were tucks and gathers. I tried my best to kind of smooth it out with my hands as I was going, but you can see right here, there's some tucks that are definitely quilted into the quilt top. In the case of this, finished is better than having everything absolutely perfect. This was a quilt top that my mom learned on as she was piecing it, and it's a quilt that I learned on as I was quilting. So even those are imperfections that most of us wouldn't want to see in a quilt. To me, that's part of the story of how she learned and I learned. So I left them in, and there weren't really that many. Honestly, I think by the time this thing is bound, washed, dried, and snuggled a few times, you're probably not even going to notice it that much. Like I said, this one stitched out super quickly. Would you believe that we are already at the bottom of the quilt? I know, I can't believe it either. And I'm actually quite pleased here because with the amount of fullness that was in this quilt top, I would have expected the bottom to be wavy. But as you can see from what I just did, when I basted that bottom edge, it wasn't nearly as wavy as it would have been had I not eased in the fullness as I was going. So the last row is stitching out here, and I cannot wait to show you what this looks like when it's all done. So my quilt's all done, and this is what it looks like here. I'm putting some image on the screen in front of you so that you can see the finished product. It has not yet been bound, or I don't even think squared up, if I'm being honest, but that's something that is on my list to do. I think one of my live streams in the very near future is going to be binding quilts, because the number of quilts that have come off my long arm in the past few weeks is absolutely amazing. I've done no stitching, but I've done a lot of quilting. Having a blast with the long arm. Let me know in the comments down below if you enjoyed this type of content. This was a different format that I had in my head for a while, and I'd love to know what you guys thought. Thank you, friends, for checking out my video this week, and I'll see you guys all real soon. Bye!